Thank you all for your perspectives on the permitting challenges facing the clean energy industry across the country. I'm Sean Affelter, Vice President of Government Relations at Crest Forum, here to introduce our next series of congressional speakers. There is growing consensus in Congress about the need for meaningful permitting reform that will accelerate the deployment of clean energy and invigorate local economies. Now you'll hear from members of Congress who have a deep understanding of the policies we need to advance a cleaner energy future.
Hello everyone, Congressman Pete Stauber from Minnesota's 8th Congressional District. Thank you for inviting me to address you on National Clean Energy Week. As the chairman of the House Natural Resources Subcommittee on Energy and Minerals Resources, I know we can't talk about clean energy without discussing the role mining plays in this space. As the demand for renewable energy technology grows, we must acknowledge that much of this technology is built from resources that come from the ground. Clean energy means more mined minerals. So we must ask ourselves where we want these minerals to come from. My home state of Minnesota is ready to lead the charge in the development of the minerals necessary for clean energy. The Duluth Complex, located in Minnesota's 8th Congressional District, is the largest copper-nickel find in the world. Sadly, the anti-mining activists in the Biden administration made the decision to pull the mineral leases and prevent the responsible development of the Duluth Complex. And this was not a one-off. Even though we have the best environmental and labor standards in the world, we continue to see good mining projects across the United States get caught up in permitting battles, duplicative red tape, and endless litigation. This leaves us reliant on hostile and unpredictable nations that have terrible environmental track records and dismal labor standards. For example, the cobalt used in EV batteries mostly comes from Chinese-run mines located in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where they lack environmental standards and allow and use child slave labor. It doesn't have to be this way. In Congress, I have made it my mission to lead the policy charge on legislation that will allow good domestic mining projects to move forward and empower America's miners to responsibly develop these resources right here at home. For example, earlier this year, I introduced the Permitting for Mining Needs Act. This legislation will help get shovels in the ground by streamlining the permitting process for mining projects nationwide. And I was proud to see this legislation pass the House as part of H.R. 1, the Lower Energy Costs Act. This legislation is just the tip of the spear. Our House Republican Conference is serious about restoring American mineral dominance, and you can bet that you will see similar common sense legislation coming down the pipeline. I urge my colleagues in the Senate and the Biden administration to get on the same page. Clean energy requires mining, and I personally would rather see these resources developed here in the United States under the strongest environmental and labor standards in the world. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Congressman Blake Moore, and I represent Utah's 1st District in Congress. I'm thankful for the opportunity to address you during the Policymakers Symposium as part of this Clean Energy Weeks program. As you know, America is a global leader in clean energy production, from wind and solar to cutting-edge nuclear to, of course, traditional fossil fuels. We know that our economies and our communities can thrive when our baseload power is reliable and affordable. And it's essential that we embrace an all-of-the-above energy approach so Americans can keep the lights on through natural disasters, outages, and other unexpected events. As we've seen in recent years, we cannot rely on foreign energy sources, especially from our adversaries. As China and Russia fight for dominance on the global energy stage, we must bolster our domestic energy production. Russia's war in Ukraine proved that global instability directly impacts our energy supply and, more importantly, our costs. And the world's reliance on Russian oil has caused hardworking families to feel the financial pinch as they face historic prices when they pay their energy bills and fuel their cars. Unfortunately, President Biden has suppressed domestic energy production since the very beginning of his administration. Americans know that it is past time to allow America to do what we do best: innovate and lead. As a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, I work with my colleagues on legislation that will reform the tax code. In June of this year, we passed through committee the Build It in America Act to counter China's increasing influence and relieve Americans from high prices at the gas pump. This is done by restoring business competitiveness, securing global supply chains, and prohibiting U.S. foreign land sales to companies from countries of concern. I was also excited to be part of passing the Lower Energy Cost Act, which was the top legislative priority for House Republicans at the start of this Congress, the 118th. Among many other key components, this bill would cut regulatory red tape and reform the permitting process so that innovative energy projects can begin and America can be home to top-of-the-line, reliable, and diverse energy sources. Instead of limiting energy sources, we should expand them responsibly and sustainably. I appreciate the great work you all do in promoting our many energy resources. A multitude of energy sources will create a multitude of jobs and thriving economies throughout America. I'm grateful to partner with you in this effort, and I wish you a wonderful Clean Energy Week.
Hi, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Jen Kiggins from Virginia's 2nd District. Thank you so much for having me to speak at your 2023 National Clean Energy Week Policy Symposium. I'm honored to have been named a 2023 CRESS Clean Energy Champion. For too long, conservatives have been all too willing to take the backseat on climate and energy issues. We live in the greatest country in the world, and we can acknowledge the challenges that a changing climate presents to our nation and believe that we have the tools, resources, and technologies to counter that change. To counteract the stronghold that inflation and Washington bureaucracy have put on American energy markets, we need an all-of-the-above energy strategy that secures our energy independence and provides the American people with affordable, reliable, and clean energy. There's no nation in the world better at reducing emissions than the United States. In fact, over the last 10 years, we've achieved the largest emissions reduction in the history of conventional energy. How? By using a practical all-of-the-above energy strategy, which allowed us to accomplish these goals while also lowering energy costs for our families around the country. It may seem like rocket science to some, but everyone in this room knows these two goals are not at odds. In fact, they are the same thing. I'm very thankful that we have a growing number of like-minded policymakers who feel the same way, both here in Congress and in Virginia. I'm excited that the Commonwealth of Virginia, which I call home, is leading on this common sense approach to energy. I'm blessed to represent Virginia Beach and Western Tidewater region and Virginia's Eastern Shore. My district features miles of beautiful coastline, shimmering coastal waterways, and abundant wildlife, all of which are critical to our economy and our way of life. As coastal Virginians, we know how to be good stewards of the environment without sacrificing our economy and the jobs that fuel it. That's why Southeast Virginia utilizes traditional and renewable sources to keep our lights on. In particular, offshore wind in the Chesapeake Bay will offer an innovative and clean energy solution for our community while lowering costs for consumers and bringing jobs to the region. I'm proud to be a loud voice for our renewable energy industry in the halls of Congress. I remain committed to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to ensure that our nation continues to be the emissions-reducing, energy-dominant, conservation-focused powerhouse we know it can be. Thank you again for having me and for naming me a Clean Energy Champion. It's truly an honor. Take care.
Geopolitical tensions increasingly threaten America's energy security. Instead of developing domestic resources, encouraging research, and adopting the business environment necessary to increase domestic production, we have too long instituted policies that resulted in the U.S. being reliant on foreign adversaries, where carbon emissions are high and labor standards are low. Once again, I'm Christy Hartman, Vice President of External Affairs at CRESS Forum. Our next moderator is Layla Kimbrell, the Executive Director of the Resource Development Council for Alaska. She will lead a group of industry experts in a conversation exploring how policymakers can address our critical minerals challenges and strengthen global supply chains. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Christine, and thank you to all of the people at CRESS who have made National Clean Energy Week possible. We're very excited to be part of the Policymaker Symposium. With us today, I'll do some brief introductions and then talk about our time on critical minerals and the supply chain issues we face. First, we have Jeremy Furr, Senior Vice President of Strategic Sourcing with Stryten Energy. Next, we have another Jeremy Harrell, who is the Chief Strategy Officer for ClearPath. Christopher Minardi, Director of Communications for North America at Nexans. And Ben Steinberg, Executive Vice President and Co-Chair for Venn Strategies Critical Infrastructure Group. Each of our industry experts will have a brief presentation today for us, and after that we'll have some moderated conversation, and we'll then open it up to audience Q&A. So for our audience out there today, thank you for joining us, and do send us in your questions. So first we will begin with Jeremy Furr.
Thank you, Leah. So we'll give you a few minutes to let a little overview of Stryten Energy and how this effort is important to us and what we're doing as a part of our own supply chain to help to mitigate the risk as it relates to critical minerals. Once again, I am Jeremy Furr. I'm Senior Vice President, Strategic Sourcing for Stryten Energy. I've been with the company for 6 years. I've spent 22 years in the energy storage and energy generation markets. As a part of my responsibilities in Stryten Energy, I am responsible for logistics as well as traditional procurement and also our recycling business from a commercial standpoint. So a little about Stryten to begin with. So Stryten is a 130-year plus old company that has been in energy storage for that long, making primarily lead acid batteries traditionally. We have 10 plant locations, mostly in the Midwestern U.S. We have over 2,500 employees. We have a nationwide network of service locations to support our customers' needs. And we're capable in those factories mentioned of making 14 plus gigawatt hours of energy storage in a given year. Recently, we've added to our portfolios battery chemistries of lithium as well as vanadium. We're doing this because we believe in this current environment, energy needs and energy storage needs are very complex, and no one battery chemistry necessarily fulfills all the needs that the industry and the country need. So a little brief overview on those battery technologies that we offer. So from a lithium standpoint, most people are familiar with lithium. It's high energy density. It is a high upfront investment. It's got many end uses. We use it in everything, of course, from power tools to EVs to power storage, UPSs. One drawback, of course, of lithium right now, at least, is that we are heavily dependent on a Chinese-controlled supply base, which I'm sure we'll talk about more in this discussion. Vanadium, that's a redox flow battery. Vanadium also takes a good bit of upfront investment. The good thing about vanadium is that it has an infinite life to it, theoretically. And most of its components can be sourced within the United States. And then the third technology, which kind of fits into the recent comments made by Eric Shea, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Storage for the DOE. His comments were that the Energy Storage Division's goal is to identify safe, low-cost, and earth-abundant elements that enable cost-effective, long-duration storage. And really, lead fits that one, at least from the U.S. for the time being, because it is a safe, it's reliable, it comes at a reasonable price. It doesn't have the same energy density as lithium. It does have to be replaced more often, but it is a recyclable product, which to date, that's the area that we're putting a lot of effort in lithium, but we haven't quite gotten there at this point. We'll go to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit more about that circular economy as it relates to lead acid batteries, at least. And really, the reason I'm bringing this up more than anything is to talk to the fact that this is where we need to strive to be. This is where we need to strive to be in all of our energy storage supply chains. A lead battery can be infinitely recycled in theory. There's no loss of performance in the recycling process using a recycled lead versus using a new lead. Really, you don't have any kind of degradation whatsoever in the performance of the battery itself. Every hybrid and every electric vehicle in the world, for the most part, has got a lead battery in it somewhere. In the U.S., we recycle 160 million lead batteries a year. That keeps those batteries out of landfills. But one of the things it does is it keeps that material in our country. And so one thing you may hear me say more later is I think one of the super critical parts about the lithium supply chain in particular is that we keep that lithium material in our country and we don't export that material for recycling. We've got to keep that circular economy for lithium and those critical minerals inside the United States. Lead batteries have a 99% recycling rate, which is the standard that we need to try to reach with every chemistry. Every new lead battery has around 80% recycled material in it. And that being batteries, it's not just automotive batteries. Lead batteries are used for network power, UPS battery backup type applications, as well as motive power, forklifts, locomotives, and even nuclear submarines. So they are used quite often in many places, much as other energy storage solutions are. But I do think it sets that benchmark for where we want to be with lithium and with some of the other chemistries over the next few years. With that, that's all I have right now. But look forward to taking part in the panel, and I'll hand it over to the next speaker.
Hello, my name is Chris Minardi. So I'm the Director of Communications at Nexans. So Nexans is a cable and solutions provider that has about 28,000 worldwide employees and about $7 billion in annual turnover. We're present in 42 countries, and my scope mostly includes the United States and Canada. Now, our presence in the US and Canada, copper for us is a primary resource, and so we build cables. But in the US, primarily, we build subsea cables for offshore wind farms, so export cables, which is really the cable that goes from the substation to shore. And then in Canada, about 75% of the business is like housing and building cable, while about 25% of the business is utility scale, and that's more on the West Coast. So all of this requires a lot of copper. We also have some aluminum, but it's primarily copper. And it's just our businesses all are revolving around electrification ultimately. And electrification is going to require a lot of minerals and specifically copper. And when we look at the greater scale of how copper kind of interacts with electrification more broadly, so EVs, your phones, your tablets, everything, it's going to create a massive demand for copper in the next coming decades. 2 times the amount of copper is found in an EV than it is in a traditional car. And the grid itself really needs a revamp in order to sustain a lot of this clean energy that we're pumping into the grid via offshore wind or solar, et cetera. So most of our copper is sourced from a variety of different locations. I think a lot of it's from suppliers across North America, such as Glencore. But we also have our own recycled material, copper. And for us, that's the big solution to a lot of these supply problems. We're going to have a big gap in demand and supply in the coming years because of electrification. And a lot of the stuff that we take in is circular. So we get the copper, whether it's from the recycled material, usually comes from some partners that come to our Montreal facility, which is a foundry that we have in Montreal. That then is combined with raw copper that we actually get, funny enough, from a conveyor belt that is literally next to the same building or similar buildings. So talk about supply chain. I mean, we're really right there. And that produces roughly around 240,000 metric tons of copper annually, with about 10% of that being recycled copper. And then we take that recycled copper and raw copper, we turn it into copper rod, and then it gets transported all around the world. So we sell to ourselves primarily, but we also sell to other partners around the world. And what's interesting about it is specifically in the United States market, when it comes to offshore wind, which is our primary market here, we are getting most of our copper from our Montreal facility, if not all of it. And so once that copper is then sent to Charleston, we create the subsea export cables with it, and then any scraps left over actually get back into the economy. So we have a whole, no copper is left sitting anywhere in the facility. It goes into specific bins for recycling, and it goes back right into the system to be somehow, in some cases, picked up again by the Montreal facility and our partners in Canada. So it's this big circle of copper. Now, the Charleston facility is something that I think is also worth mentioning because this is about supply chain as well as it's about critical minerals. And the U.S. supply chain for offshore wind is in Charleston for us. We are the only cable manufacturer in the United States, subsea cable manufacturer on U.S. soil. And we are proud of that point right now. We produce so far we've produced the copper or the subsea cable for South Fork Wind, which is off the coast of New York. But we also have contracts for Revolution Wind and Empire Wind with Equinor. So a lot of big projects that we're looking forward to, committing to. And ultimately, for us, it's that's just part of the puzzle. The entire grid, as I mentioned earlier, is really old, and it's aging. It's just, there's no way around it in the United States and in Europe. And we need to revamp that in order to not just bring clean energy onto the grid, but also to make sure that we actually decarbonize in a way that's sustainable. And the way to do that ultimately is by rebuilding a lot of this stuff. Most of our generation is focused in the middle of the country, and so it's tough. We have to renegotiate where the lines are between transmission and distribution. And ultimately that starts with us and with offshore wind for our market specifically. So that's kind of a summary of kind of where we sit with the copper situation. And I'll pass it off to the next speaker.
Hi, everyone. My name's Ben Steinberg. I'm an executive vice president from Venn Strategies. I'm going to take a macro view today to share with you what's going on in Washington, D.C. around the critical minerals and specifically the battery supply chain. Today, I'm representing the Battery Materials and Technology Coalition. It's a 17-company coalition that mines, processes, manufactures, and recycles battery materials, components, and cells. And it spans companies that work on lithium, nickel, manganese, graphite, and silicon, for example. We've been working extensively with the federal government since 2020 when we formed. We put together bipartisan legislation in the House and Senate that ultimately became part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, $6 billion in grant funding for battery materials, processing, and recycling. So very proud of that. And we've also worked extensively with Congress and the Defense Department on boosting the use of the Defense Production Act, Title III, fund for critical minerals production. I wanted to take just a few minutes to flash a few slides up for you to really give you a sense of what's going on. The coordination on critical minerals for batteries has been going on for years. It started in the Trump administration and has carried through into the Biden administration. When the president took office, President Biden, he signed Executive Order 14017, which is on America's supply chains. And one of the two focus areas was on critical minerals and batteries. And this last October, the administration launched the American Battery Materials Initiative, which shows the focus and coordination across the federal agencies. So on the right-hand side, you'll see the top three agencies are the primary funding agencies who are doling out funding from things like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Again, there's Defense Production Act funding. There's also semiconductor funding coming from Commerce for semiconductor chips. In the middle section, you have EPA and Interior. And really, there are a lot of regulations and standards being built by those agencies. EPA is working on eco-labels and recycling standards, also on permitting. Obviously, you have Department of Interior working on permitting projects on federal lands. And then on the bottom half of these agencies, you have a lot of work going on trade and commerce abroad, and how do we work with our partners And then how do we block our adversaries really from entering into the U.S. market? So that gives you a sense of sort of there are over 20 agencies working on critical minerals. On the next slide, you have the major pots of funding that have come out from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is mostly tax credits. I talked about the DoD funding. There's also multiple sets of loans that you can get as a company from DOE, from their loan program, but also if you're working internationally or on export imports, you can work with the Development Finance Corporation or the Export Import Bank. And of course, there's always every year, there are programs that the federal government is building on annual appropriations that foster research and development in this space. So we're going to get into it in the panel, but I wanted to show there is a broad suite of funding opportunities available from the public sector. Obviously, that has to be matched with project developers and financiers. So I wanted to conclude with a few challenges that the industry is facing, which we'll cover a bunch in our Q&A. But first of all, how do we deploy all this money from the infrastructure bill and the IRA and protect that investment while also working with our partners abroad? How do we make sure that cheaper products aren't being imported, which then dilute the benefit of having these premium products made with American labor, with our standards, from coming to fruition? I think those, with the public funding out there, how do we set up the right trade and tariff regime and make sure that we're protecting our investments here? That's sort of challenge number one. Second challenge is on regulatory certainty, or should I say uncertainty. There's so much uncertainty that's brought to timelines for these projects. They're very capital intensive, large mining projects, processing facilities, manufacturing projects. So how do we correct this, which would include reforming permitting, reforming how lawsuits are carried out in the country, and then working on public acceptance for these projects over a long period of time. I mean, some of these projects will go on 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And then lastly, it's all about the money and the financing. It's no doubt it's a very challenging financial environment right now for project development these days, even with the public dollars available. Our coalition just held an event in New York City with financial institutions. And what we heard back from them is right now finding low-cost capital to invest in these capital-intensive projects that have risk associated with them is really difficult. We have high inflation rates right now. And so there is a little bit of a back and forth between project developers and financiers to make sure that these projects come to be. I think there's a lot of goodwill out there, and I think there's a lot of conversation happening, but I think people want to see lower inflation rates and the ability to invest in these projects. So with that, happy National Clean Energy Week, and I'm going to turn it back to our next speaker.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jeremy Harrell, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at ClearPath. ClearPath's a conservative clean energy organization here in DC, focused on accelerating technological innovation that reduce and remove global emissions. And so as we look at this critical minerals challenge ahead, we look at it through the lens of global energy transformation, right? And so how do we scale significant clean energy technologies, infrastructure, both here at home and abroad to meet those economic and environmental challenges? And there's a practical reality when looking at critical minerals as a whole. The International Energy Agency projects that demand for minerals like lithium, like graphite, like nickel could grow by 20 to 40 times by 2040 as we look to those goals. And so we have an immense challenge ahead beyond trying to accelerate those commercial deployments, but how do we source the resources necessary to make it a reality? And as ClearPath looks at the U.S. federal policy landscape, we see really 4 key areas that policymakers should be focused on as we look to meet that challenge. One is technological innovation as a whole. In the end, while the projected growing demand for those minerals or for our technologies we know we need to find ways and solutions to meet our energy needs with earth abundant resources. So research and development and new energy storage technologies, for example, that potentially use earth abundant resources. A good example is Form Energy, a long duration storage technology that recently was selected for the long duration energy demonstration program at the Department of Energy recently. Uses iron ore and earth abundant resources for their long duration storage technology. So we need to find ways to fuel our economy with earth abundant resources that we're not relying on some of our competitors or relying on international partners as a whole. 2, recycling, absolutely an essential piece of the puzzle. The minerals that we're using here in this country, we need to maximize them and really repurpose as we move forward and meet our energy needs. 3, it's international partnerships, and my fellow panelists talk a little bit about this as well. How do we work with allies, like folks with like-minded values, with the same type of respect for workers, with who aren't going to be undercutting U.S. industry? How do we partner with them in strategic ways, bilateral and multilateral agreements to source our critical minerals needs? And last but not least, we have to mine and we need to process more here in this country. And I think issue number 1 at the top of that list is to restore some regulatory certainty for those type of projects. When push comes to shove, where innovation's an important driver, it can contribute to solving the solution, reducing mineral needs. Recycling is important, but isn't going to meet that 20 to 40x demand increase that may be necessary over the next 30 years. So we need to be able to produce more in this country. And that's why permitting reform has really been a huge focus of the Congress and many of our organizations. It's been a top priority for ClearPath in this new Congress. The current system, unfortunately, just is not conducive to the private sector investment that is needed. And even if the federal government is de-risking some of these projects with financial support, it doesn't change that the regulatory process can really 3-4x the cost of your project, or in some ways put you in a regulatory limbo. As we look at regulatory reform as a whole, I think there's really 3 important things that need to be taken care of. First and foremost, project developers need to know that a decision in one administration will carry forward to another, right? We need to depoliticize the regulatory process, particularly for these type of projects. We've unfortunately seen the current administration reverse the decision from the previous on some critical projects like the Rosemont or the Resolution Copper project in Arizona and the Twin Peaks project in Minnesota. And so we need to depoliticize the decision-making processes in many of these nationally significant projects. 2, we need to really streamline the process moving forward and ensure that the environmental reviews for these type of projects are within scope of what the project actually impacts, and recognize that in the end there are going to be trade-offs, right? As we look to massively scale up clean energy in this country as a whole, like there is no 100% consensus areas, right? So we have to work through the challenging environmental challenges. We need to balance the key issues ahead and balance the need for speed, diligence, and really ensure the protection for our communities, which is of the foremost of priorities. And last but not least, we need to restore some more sanity to the judicial process as a whole. The judicial process in this country, frankly, was established on environmental laws from the 1970s that were focused on avoiding adverse consequences, things that unfortunately were doing real damage to our environment in this country and needed to be reined in. Those laws weren't constructed with the thought of the clean energy transformation challenge we have ahead. And so we need to change that paradigm and so that we're promoting good business practices, good projects that ultimately provide economic values to our communities, rather than essentially giving anyone who wants to stop a project every opportunity to do so. That judicial uncertainty we've seen firsthand over the last couple of years kill significant critical minerals projects that would be really important to meeting our domestic needs for things like copper, for example. And so we're strongly supporting permitting reform. We think that it is an essential piece of this puzzle. But when push comes to shove, it needs to be a comprehensive approach, right? We need to maximize research and development. We need to focus on recycling and find new ways to maximize resources here at home. We need to work with our international partners and global partners to meet our mineral needs and ultimately restore sanity to the regulatory process in this country. So I'm really looking forward to talking more with my fellow panelists. So thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Well, why don't we jump in, I think, where Jeremy Harrell kind of left off on policy reforms. I know there was a panel earlier today that really did a deep dive on federal permitting reforms and the debate that's out there. But we know we do need more mining just to answer some of the supply chain issues. We have federal administrations that support clean energy transitions and are supporting these technologies, Ben, as you showed in your slide deck. But in a recent subcommittee hearing that occurred before the House Natural Resources Committee, it was reported that BLM has actually issued fewer mineral leases over the past 2 years, fewer leases at any time since going back to World War II. So maybe we have a supply issue in leasing that's also being issued. Maybe that's at the state level as well. So building on the need for permitting reforms, maybe we can do a deeper dive in the context of mineral development. Who would like to kick off, where we have challenges on the leasing side, and maybe it's more than just permitting reform, but maybe there's some state reforms that we need to be considering in this broader debate. For someone like me, I'm from Alaska. A lot of our issues really occur at the federal level with our permitting and with our projects, simply because we have a large percentage of lands held in federal ownership. But I know that's not the case everywhere. So with that, why don't I open it up to some conversation there?
You make a great point on the state and local level. And in my experience, and when I was in government, I worked in both the Nevada delegation, the Silver State, and the Arizona delegation, our largest producer of copper. And we found when you're avoiding federal lands, in many cases, the record decision or getting in through the environmental permits would take almost 20 to 30% less time to come forward when you're working with states who are used to it, who historically were mining states, things along those lines. On the federal side, EIS reviews were averaging, 4.5, 5 years until a record decision. 25% of those EISs were taking more than 6 years. And so that's just a challenge we simply can't move that slow if we're going to meet the needs of this country as we fuel a clean energy transformation. And so those things all need to work together, right? And unfortunately, in many cases, it's local, state, and federal level engagement that is essential to not only the mines, but also the processing, smelting, things along those lines.
One thing, Jeremy did a great job talking through all the issues on permitting reform that need to take place. Two things I'll just mention, and one I'll foot stomp on what Jeremy said. But the first is the understaffing at the federal, state, and local level. A lot of times at the local, state level, they have to do one permit at a time because they don't have the bandwidth to do things multiple, because they don't have the staff. On the federal side, there are hundreds and hundreds of staffers missing at the Army Corps of Engineers, at Department of Interior, at the EPA, that really are going to drive
delay on Ben's computer. So we'll see if we can get him back online. In the meantime, I think Ben makes a good point. Maybe it's not fair to always be beating up on the political side of the process. Understaffing really is a true issue. Ben, we did lose you for a little bit there. Can you hear us now? I think we still might be having a few issues there with him. Jeremy, anything more to add? You mentioned the need to kind of streamline the process through the courts. Sometimes I refer to this as what we need tort reform for the permitting process, for getting leases issued, getting permits issued. How can we build on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. As I talk to developers in this space, the litigation risk related after permits are issued remains one of the biggest wild cards for developers, and what is like a central challenge in attracting private sector capital. And so I think there's a couple key things that need to be done. And we're supporting, ClearPath Action supporting proposals that centralize some of these legal challenges to permits at a single administrative venue, elevate some of the more complicated ones to the Court of Appeals, for example. And we really need to narrow the scope of things in which people can litigate ultimately. Far too often, extraneous issues are being brought up in this litigation, and it takes years and resources. I mean, you mentioned the constraints on federal agencies. There's constraints on our courts as well, and I know many of us are worried about resource development and climate. Those constraints span the full gamut of legal challenges that are out there, and so it also lays case to things like the administrative appeals processes that BLM has, for example, that tries to resolve those things more at the early stages before it gets to going to the Circuit Court of Appeals or something like the Court of Appeals or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
That was going to be my second point. You did it for me.
Great. Well, let's move kind of back to the innovation side of things. Jeremy and Chris, you talked a lot about recycling. We also have kind of reprocessing out there as an element of how we're addressing the supply chain challenges. But the World Bank reported just recently that even if we scale up and we recycle as much as we can, even if we scaled up to 100% of recycling for copper and aluminum, for example, we still aren't going to meet our needs. So a lot of people talk about recycling as one piece of the puzzle. We certainly can't recycle our way out of this issue. So what else is happening out in that space that maybe you weren't able to touch upon in your presentations that we also need to be considering?
Well, I think that it may not be the only solution. I recognize it's not, but I think without it, you'll never catch up with the demand just via mining and smelting. I think you got to have recycling has to be a part of that chain, much like it is in the lead acid battery world today. It's got to be the same way. We got to perfect the technologies on lithium recycling to get back to battery grade materials and not be getting to just a black mass that we ship to China or somewhere offshore to then be processed into battery grade. And we really just, I know there's many labs, there's a lot of money being thrown at it, and which is all the right thing to do. But I just think we can't do that fast enough. I mean, the wave of lithium coming back for recycling has not really hit yet, but in 3 to 5 years it will. And we don't want to be sending those battery packs from EVs and other applications to other countries to be recycled. We want to keep them here. So the time to do it's not to work on it 3 years out when it's a problem. It's just to work on it now. But I totally recognize we're going to have to do more mining in the U.S. I agree with a lot of the points that Jeremy and Ben both made. We're going to have to streamline that process, put the resources where they need to be done, and get through it. I mean, this country's been through a lot of things before. When we put our resources together, we can do great things. We just need to put the focus there, I think.
Yeah, from a copper perspective, I think a lot of it is it's going to have to do with opening more mines. I think The problem is the length of time it takes to open these mines and to build them. I mean, it's like 8 years, I think, from start to finish to permit and build, to go through with a copper mine. And unfortunately, we don't have that time. I think by 2030, we're going to have roughly like 30 million metric tons of demand with only about 25 million metric tons of capacity at the current rate, based on the fact that it takes so long to open a new mine. But I think where recycling can come in is, especially if we really focus on revamping the grid, I think we can take all of that excess cable and wire and turn it into real, I don't think that was factored into it, right? When you're rebuilding something, you can take it down. It's like having an urban mine essentially within the cities that you can take apart and then repurpose. I think that, plus combining it with more efficient practices for getting copper recycled, I think will help solve that gap. But yeah, this is definitely a challenge that we're going to have to face in the very near term.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy or Ben, anything more to add on that point before we move on?
I think the bit on batteries, I agree with everything Jeremy said. We haven't reached a critical mass yet. I think a lot of the recyclers in the EV battery space that are setting up are working off scraps and defunct batteries. And so as EVs come off the market and off the grid, you're going to see to Jeremy's point, you don't want to send them abroad. You want to be putting them back into the system infinitely. So I think we are going to see it. It's just 10, 15, 20 years out is really when it's going to go boom in a good way.
Yeah. It's like you raise a good point on EVs and the need. And as we see a significant uptick in consumer adoption of EVs, like, let's focus more research and development resources on grid technologies in the storage space, right? Like, if we need to concentrate our lithium, cobalt, things along those lines into vehicles, like, let's find ways to do long duration storage. It's why we're really excited about the announcement the Department of Energy had just last week, which was their kind of first wave of the over $300 million program for the long duration storage demonstration program.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. With the innovation part of it too, not just with EVs but with everything, is like reducing the amount of raw materials needed in a lot of this stuff. I think will also help substantially. Like if 30 years ago, a computer was way bigger than it is now, and so we can see that it requires less materials, right? So I think that's also like in tandem at the same time. We need to start to figure out how to innovate to reduce the amount of materials necessary, and I think that will help us, I think, achieve our, circular economy ultimately.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a question from the audience. So why don't we take one of those now? Ben, this might be coming to you. Can you discuss how the advanced manufacturing tax credit has helped to boost domestic mineral processing?
It's
on the spot, but if
no, it's great. I mean, it's TBD. Right. I mean, we saw the advanced manufacturing tax credit in the Recovery Act from 2009, from the 2009 to 2011 timeframe, which was hugely beneficial. We are now seeing a deployment of the tax credit. The first tranche of it is $4 billion. I think 1.6 of it is going to disadvantaged communities. And then they will have a second tranche, another $6 billion they'll deploy. So the Department of Treasury, the Department of Energy are working together right now to review applications. And it covers critical minerals projects. It covers tech across wind, solar, batteries. And this is up to 30% tax write-off on the development of your project. So it's real impactful, and can't wait to see which projects are selected in the first round, which they hopefully they're going to make decisions on the first round. It's a two-step process, so hopefully they make decisions on the first step soon.
Great, thank you. Well, we have a few more minutes of time left, and one of the issues we haven't really touched on yet is, the role of critical minerals and how they play into our national security. So let's transition to that. And a few of you made some comments in your presentations there. But the DoD reports it uses more than 750,000 tons annually of minerals in the creation and production of technologies to support the military functions. I actually just read a statistic that an F-35 fighter jet alone requires more than 900 pounds of rare earth elements. We haven't really talked about those a lot, but without question, the fact that we can't source it all ourselves means we're reliant on foreign sources for materials. It obviously raises a question for our own national security in that context. So what more can we do? Because obviously we're going to stay reliant on outside external sources for our supply needs.
Yeah, I can use one example. ClearPath works quite a bit on nuclear technologies, for example, and this is a really critical issue that's being debated by Congress right now as part of actually the government funding bill and the National Defense Authorization Bill. For the next generation of advanced reactors, Russia is effectively the only commercial source of the advanced fuel called high assay low enriched uranium you would need for some of those. And frankly, our reactors that operate today that provide 20% of the power to our grid rely on foreign sources of enriched product for nuclear fuel here. We need to make investments with partners and strategic partnerships. This administration made a really important announcement at the last G7 with the nuclear developing nations that folks like the UK, the US, the French, the Japanese were going to work together as a team to reduce their reliance on Russian nuclear products to zero over the next 10, 15 years. And so that's going to require us both investing in our domestic capacity here in the US, as well as partnering with some of our key allies who have their own enrichment capabilities and development capabilities. I think that's the type of thing that's going to be necessary to really meet the challenge here. Absolutely, we need to produce more here. That should be issue number one. But there's a practical reality of if we're truly talking about a 20 to 40x increase in the need for some of these minerals over the next 30 years, we're going to have to partner with some of our allies, including our allies to the north, like the Canadians, who have ample resources as well.
So I would add, I think this is all about trade and partnerships. And, we haven't talked about foreign entities of concern and making sure that we're not partnering with certain countries. However, in the battery supply chain and critical mineral supply chain, if you're in the game today, you're in China in some capacity. So how do we de-risk that? You can't decouple completely. How do you de-risk that? And that's what's being debated, as Jeremy was talking about, in Congress very actively. So how do you enforce your 301 tariffs on China? A lot of those are exempted because we don't do the work here. But if we don't enforce it, the investment doesn't happen here. How do you work on things like a carbon border adjustment mechanism that on imports from heavy emitting countries to make sure that carbon emissions is taken into account? How do you make sure you have strong foreign entity of concern guidance in federal funding? How do you have a stronger committee on foreign investment in the US? Right now, companies can just put a greenfield in or invest in the US in certain ways, and it can't be blocked by the government. And then how do you block loopholes in the system so a country like Russia or China can't use a third country to push their materials through it? So we have a lot of work to do to shore up those mechanisms that protect our investments here in the United States, including the military.
Great, thank you. Well, we had another audience question come in, and they, with a focus about our conversation about the legal inefficiencies as part of our leasing and permitting process. So coming back to that concept, what can Congress do to add a degree of reasonableness to litigation so we can resume domestic mining?
a lot of the proposals out there in Congress, bipartisan proposals, ask for limitations on timelines for judicial review. And I think that's absolutely reasonable, that a court should be held to timelines, the federal agencies should be held to timelines, litigants should be held to timelines, so you drive some certainty in the process. Jeremy talked about, there's not enough staffing in the courts to do this work too, so that's going to slow things down, but certainly there's no reason why timelines can't be set on these lawsuits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, on every side of on the House and the Senate, Republican and Democrat side, every single permitting proposal out there has something on judicial review in some shape or form, and it's limiting standing for folks who can litigate, statutes of limitation, injunctive relief, court timelines. All these type of things are ways that we can try to get at this and ensure that, again, the judicial process it is important. Don't get me wrong. The ability to ensure that our laws are being upheld, it's unfortunately just too often being abused, and so we need to limit the frivolous lawsuits that are out there, so that maybe doesn't need to delay nationally significant projects. And that way, the limited resources at the courts can actually spend their resources on central issues that maybe are threatening in environmental quality or frankly just processes that need to be done to ensure proper community engagement.
I think part of it's also the narrative too, and making sure we shape the narrative correctly. I think that's a lot of it. I think a lot of these lawsuits, the ones that are the least threat, but like they take up the time of the court, but they're basically nothing cases, are done in order to slow the projects down, like on purpose. And I think that's because of a lot of misunderstanding on like the reality of the project and the fact that like these are critical to our way of life. And like if we actually want to decarbonize and we want to do what everyone like wants to do and be more sustainable, we have to do this mining. Like it's just like, so I think combining that and making sure that that's very clear to people, I think is a super important aspect of it that's overlooked a lot of the time.
Chris, that's a nice segue to, I think, what will be our last question for the day. And this is really building on public perception. We talk about litigation. We talk about the need for critical minerals and other minerals, right? Not just critical minerals, but other things like lead, gold, silver copper that aren't on those critical mineral lists. And it's been said, and something we like to say a lot in Alaska is, if it can't be grown, it must be mined. So we support clean energy technologies, we support recycling, we support repurposing. And we generally support the concept that we need these minerals, but we see time and time again, the specific project gets either reversed or politicized. It's opposed to an extent that it just doesn't happen. So what can we do better to connect the dots between the materials needed and the end product that we want? Because this is probably one of the most important things in my life on a daily basis. But we got to connect those dots a little bit better. Any thoughts on how we can do that collectively?
I think just getting in front of the media and being honest about it. I think that's such a big part of it that people skimp over. I think honesty is everything. And if we say like, look, we're not going to achieve our goals here, like unless we do this, like then I don't think we're going to go anywhere. I think that's a big part of it. It's funny that a lot of the times the same people who want to make these massive changes are also the ones who are the ones fighting this stuff at a very local level. And you're like, why is this, it just doesn't compute. And I think a lot of it is because of a misunderstanding of the bigger picture of the supply chain. And I think if we can tell people that and show them a long-term like plan and understand how that kind of fits into the global perspective of the renewable transition, I think people will be more adaptive and receptive to it, and less lawsuits, hopefully.
Yeah, I agree. The not in my backyard mentality is a tough thing to get past. I mean, we have to do that in our industry a lot too. And one of the best things and most effective things we found is inviting the community out, like having open houses, walk them through, show them that you're environmentally responsible and you're a good steward. I know you can't really bring them into a mind, so to speak, but I think that the companies could do a better job in upfront public relations than they probably do today to sell the community on the concept versus trying to sell the government or someone else on it. There's really the citizens that need to sell on it, I believe. So.
All right, Jeremy Harrell, final word.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I agree in that proactive nature. Like in I think it's one thing that's really shifted on the way to operate and do business. Like you need to invest in the community. How do you engage? How do you take head on critiques, things along those lines? How do you invest and try to mitigate environmental impacts? I mean, we're talking about mining here, like, and I'm very pro mining, and we have to recognize like it does have environmental impacts, right? And so, how do we invest in reclamation? How do we give the community confidence that it's going to be the community is going to be left in a better place as in a macro level, better than it was before as a result of this project. And that doesn't mean consensus, right? Like, and I think that's one struggle that's happened here. Like nothing in this world is 100%, right? Like we have to find a way how to mitigate some of these impacts. How do we limit the impacts that they have while still gaining significant benefits, not only from the jobs, the economic production, but also the resources that it's going to fuel, right? The clean energy transformation, the new technologies it's going to transform as we source these resources. So I think it's a really important piece of the puzzle.
Thank you. Well, on that note, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone a little over time. I want to thank our panelists for participating today and sharing your expertise from your respective industries. I know we just scratched the surface, but it's an important conversation to have. I want to thank the audience for sharing questions today. And with that, I think we are closing out for the perhaps one of the last panels for the day.
I hope you all enjoyed our second day of the National Clean Energy Week Policymakers Symposium. I want to thank our sponsors who make this symposium possible, and to all of our symposium participants for sharing their knowledge and perspective with us. Tomorrow, the third and final day of the 2023 Policymakers Symposium will be available both virtually and in person at the Hamilton Hotel in downtown Washington, D.C. Attendees can look forward to hearing more about the decarbonization work by American industries, updates on the commercialization and deployment of clean energy technologies, and the importance of public-private partnerships. I hope to see you there.